Let's begin with our next concept, which is OOPS. We will start learning fundamentals of OOPS and then we will slowly deep into dive with further concepts of OOPS. So first of all, OOPS stands for Object Oriented Programming Structure, which means a programming structure where we are going to create the objects, where we are going to orient the objects is known as object oriented programming structure. Now the question is, what is object? Object is nothing but real world entity. Everything in real world is an object. So you always deal with real world objects only. Now the question is, why we are using these concepts in our programming language? To understand this, you first have to understand what is the biggest advantage of using Java or any programming language which is implementing OOPS concepts. Every single programming language out there in the market is used to develop application softwares. And if you closely observe, application softwares are used to deal with real world objects only. For example, Facebook. Facebook is managing their users' data. Users is nothing but those are objects only. Similarly, if you'll go to Gmail, Gmail is again managing the real world objects emails. Again, it is dealing with real world objects. If you are booking some flight from flight booking system, that flight booking system is again managing flight, different various flights, right? And flights are nothing but those are again objects. Similarly, if you are doing something else with any portal, you will always find that these web applications are mainly deal with real world objects. So the technology vendors in 1985, when they introduced C++ very first time, they introduced OOPS concept very first time. They understood this, that every time we are going to deal with real world objects, and that's why they start thinking this concept of OOPS. They understood this. If we need to deal with real world objects, we should represent or we should create a memory container which will hold real world object data. And that's why this concept comes OOPS. So what they did, they start representing real world object data by a memory container. They directly start storing the real world object data into a memory container, and that memory container is basically behaving like a virtual object. That's not a physical object, but because that memory container is holding the information or the data of real world object, we can say that's a kind of object. And that's why we are saying that in OOPS, we basically start creating the objects. When we are saying this, we are not actually creating physical objects, but we are creating memory containers. And those memory containers are going to store real world object information. And that's why we are calling them objects. Now, we have another concept which is class. Class is nothing but representation of same type of objects. In real world, you will always find that whenever the same type of objects are there, those will always represent by class. For example, if you are making a flight booking in some certain class, economy class or any class, then you will find that for that economy class or business class, all the objects that are sitting in that area are going to receive same type of services, are going to be facilitated with the same type of things. That means all the objects which are belongs to that class are going to be common at certain point. Similarly, if you'll see in schools, if the students are going to school and sitting in a class, which means that in that particular class, in that particular standard, all the students are receiving and studying the same type of syllabus, and all the students are receiving the training from the same teachers or trainers. So in that way, all the students belongs to that certain class are going to be facilitated with the same type of things. Means all the objects are common at certain point. Similarly, they start implementing class in programming as well. So for example, if you want to represent multiple objects that are going to have the same type of functionality and you want to assign the same type of properties to them, instead of defining them separately, you will define them through a class. Then they further observe that every single object in real world consists of two things. One is property. Every single object will have certain property. For example, for me, I have some name, obviously I have some age, I have some height, okay, or I have some color tone, I have some marital status. These are the informations that belongs to me. Similarly, if you'll take another example of train booking system, there you will find obviously the management of trains. Trains again objects. Every single train will have some certain timing for arrival or departure. It will have some certain, staff members detail which belongs to that train, which are going to attend the train passengers. And similarly, there are many other information that belongs to every single train object. In that same way, every single object will have some certain information, some certain data that belongs to that object, and we call that information, that data, as properties. Properties means the things by which that object is represent, that is known as property. Okay, so every single object in real world contain this concept of properties. That's one thing every single object contain. The second thing every single object contain is functionality. Obviously, every object performs some certain functionality. If you are going to bank and bank is an object, you want to perform some functionality there. You are going to perform some withdraw there or deposit there or balance inquiry there, or there are many other functionalities are there. If you are going to train station, there again some certain functionality belong to that train station. So every single object belongs to these two things. One is properties and second is functionalities. They understood this, that every single object has these two things, so we will also going to attach these two things to our virtual object. Now, how these properties and functionality, these two things are going to represent through programming. For that reason, we have class. So what we are going to do in our class, we are going to define properties and we are going to define functionalities. And once we will define them, those two things are automatically assigned or available to all the objects that belongs to that class. Now, how we are going to define the properties? To define the properties, we will use variables. For example, age is a property. Obviously, that belongs to some certain object. So, to store the age, we will have some variable. To store the name, we will have some variable. To store the marital status, we will have some variable. To store the gender, we will have some variable. Every single time property will be represented by a variable. Similarly, functionality or behavior of real world objects are going to represent by functions or methods. So every single class in Java always consists of these two things. One is property, which is nothing but variables. We call them data members as well in programming. And second is functionalities, which we will represent by methods or member functions. So every single time these two things will be there in every single class, property and functionality, data member and member functions. Now, these data members and member functions are further classified. There are two types of data members, static data members and instance data members. Member functions are also two types, static member functions and instance member function.